Hello, and to the Bold Alone, welcome back to the Tuesday Night Fiction Podcast. I'm your host, Nicholas Austin, and tonight we're going to recap Chapter 9. That chapter was entitled Powder, and it was released last week. We're going to talk about all things leading up to the final chapter, Chapter 10. Since last week was a little more of an action-packed chapter, I'm going to start off by just kind of going through an entire recap of where we've come to this point in the first book of the Civilands series, Crimson River. Because I think that Chapter 9, like I said, a lot of action, so it's a little... There's not very much depth I can go into, especially with the final chapter coming up next. We're going to do a much larger scale discussion after Chapter 10. But for now, I'm going to try to bring it all together, talk about where we've been, talk about where we're headed next, so that when we get into Chapter 10, the explosiveness will be on full display, and you'll be ready for it. But you won't be ready for it, because there will not be any way to be ready for it. The epicness of Chapter 10 will take you by surprise. That chapter is going to be entitled For the World to See. So let's get into what happened before the world can see. So in Chapter 9, like I said, a lot of action. We saw Powder in more ways than one. So an avalanche took our comrades for a little stroll in the middle of a storm. So they were left in a precarious position, comrades being Hansa, Jeannie, and Dominic, and Harrison. Before I continue on, spoiler alert, obviously this is a recap discussion, so get caught up. This is a serial podcast. Start with Chapter 1. But anyway, so they got caught up in an avalanche. That's where we left off with them. And also, Latera, obviously, on the way south, a big explosion took her and her people by surprise. So I'm going to talk more about what happened in that chapter. I'm going to go in more in depth. But first, I'm just going to start right from the beginning. And then that's going to lead into another discussion. But let's start from the beginning. Let's go through where we've come. So, the Civilands series, the first book in the Civilands series, Crimson River, starts off with Jeannie Morel being chased through the woods. So she was being chased through the woods by the Keegan gang. And as we saw in Chapter 1, the Tokali have come north. They come to the Vahani of the Riverlands with a message that they want to unite, that they want them to come south to fight off the Keegan gang, this very same Keegan gang that's chasing Jeannie down. Along the way, despite the wishes of the chieftain in the Riverlands, Arkuda, father of Hansa, the councilmen of that chieftain betray him just as they go and save Jeannie from the Keegan gang. The councilmen abduct Jeannie, and Hansa is forced to evade. Hansa comes across Dominic Turner during his escape, who has a vested interest, who is a townsperson in Haran. He has a vested interest in saving Jeannie, as well as Hansa obviously trying to save his sister from the councilmen who betrayed their father. So together, they attack essentially the camp, forming a diversion in the form of Dominic's fireworks. They are able to rescue Jeannie, but Latera is secured by the councilmen, and she has her own breakdown moment. Latera at that time is a very nervous young nurse. She hasn't really seen much of the world. She's just the chieftain's daughter. She's not much more than that, and she's okay with it. That's part of the culture, and she hasn't really seen very much at this point. And so this new Tokali being here at this camp, this divertive attack by what she thinks is a gang at the time because they use the lion's paw pin firework along the way. It's all very scary. It's all very, very nerve-wracking to I don't want to say homebody, but a sheltered girl like Latera at the time. So Dominic and Hansa escape with Genie. They go off. They see the Keegan gang. Genie confirms that it's the Keegan gang that attacked, and the hometown of Dominic and Genie, where they kind of regroup. And along the way, Dominic's forced to revert back into things he didn't want to do in the past. He's undergone a lot of change in that way. Dominic had a history in the gangs. The gangs in the past had been much more prevalent in the Murrieta territory in numbers, so there were more gangs. But now, with the Keegan gang, they've all become more consolidated. So there's less quantity of gangs, but still just as many people who are utilizing the gangs for defense and for purposes of community in a new world that they're not familiar with. And that's the Easterners. So where we leave off kind of there, I think around the chapter 3-4 range, is Genie, Hansa, and Dominic moving into Haran. From there, the Vahani, who now are following the Tokali named Elon, begin their journey south towards the Tokali hold for what they intend to be a uniting. So they're on their way down to unite with the Tokali to fight against the Keegan gang. And along the way, forgot to mention, but along the way at the river, as we remember, they captured Walter Keegan, who was after Genie at the time. And with the help of the bears, they're able to capture Walter Keegan and hold a hostage on the way down. From there, so their journey south begins. So, in a couple different chapters, we get to meet some of the Keegan gang. We can see William at his mansion. William Keegan is the head of the Keegan gang. His brothers include Clovis and Daniel, Walter Keegan being his cousin. We also meet Donna and Blanton Keegan, who are also his cousins, Walter's brother and sister, as well as Gregory Calloway and the Abigail family, who William is married off to Judith Abigail, and her father, Henry Abigail, was a close associate in the past with William's father back east, Leonard Keegan. So William and Judith really hit it off. They have a very common set of interests, common bonds. They're very power hungry, very wealth hungry, very status oriented. And they also have a pretty grand vision together. Judith doesn't want to come to the Murrieta just to kind of live in the middle of nowhere and not enjoy the same wealth that she had before. And William's much the same. We can see that with his grand mansion in this town, with him and his family who dress all proper. They want to represent something that isn't quite of the Murrieta territory. The Murrieta territory is a wild, dangerous place, as we have found out. We've seen that. We eventually see that the Tokali clan, on the other hand, can control hogs. We see that that they discover this new ability. The Tokali are not quite as connected to the deity in the Murrieta territory that the Vahani worship, called the Mother. And so they can connect. They discover on a hunt the ability to connect with the hogs. And the ones who discover that are Elon's father and Elon's friends, who go on a hunt to prepare for Elon's arrival. It's obviously a very volatile time in the south, even more than the north. The north is kind of just experiencing this, but the south, with Elon, for some time, and they need to be ready for anything. And to connect, and Hammond, one of Elon's friends, for the first time. They're all very nervous and excited about this, obviously. They decide not to tell anyone. And so far, that's what we've seen of the Tokali and their abilities. So we don't get too much into that yet up to chapter 9. But along the way, we see more of Laterra. We see more of Hansa, Genie, and Dominic on their journey. Hansa, Genie, and Dominic find a bunch of different things in Haran. So as I mentioned, Dominic in his past with the gangs was asked to kill. He has a a very moral struggle as he goes through dealing with the Keegan gang and protecting the young Genie and Hansa. It is a difficult task to deal with the obnoxious Keegan gang. One case in particular, he goes and feels forced to kill a man named Jesse Billings, who is a member of the gang. He does so in order to protect Genie and Hansa, but he definitely struggles with it, and we can see that as he goes and buries the body between the woods between his house and another house, which we find to be that of Charles Langston. Charles Langston is the self-declared mayor of Haran. He's kind of an oaf, but along the way, when Daniel Keegan arrives in town, because Daniel's purpose is to come up in the wake of Clovis's capture, essentially, of Haran. And Daniel Keegan's job, Daniel is more of the businessman. His job is to firm up the relationships that Adonis Morel once had, that the Keegans intended to take, essentially. And Daniel and William, as we find out, thought their goal was to do it non-violently. But we find from Clovis, it brings the word that the Morels actually attacked first, that Adonis Morel, who is a prominent businessman in the north, he oversees trade relations between the Vahani and the Easterners. Obviously, in the Riverlands, a very shrewd man and a very valuable asset in terms of being able to stop violence, first of all, being able to broker peace and engage in trade and community between natives and Easterners. But it's not quite as easy as Daniel thinks. He kind of comes up into this town, and he struggles to get a grip as friends of Genie and Dominic, the Kennedales, who heard about Dominic's necessity to take down this character in the Keegan gang. They heard about it, and they lied to Daniel, and they tricked him into framing Charles Langston. So Charles Langston gets framed for the murder committed by Dominic. Meanwhile, the same Kennedales, we find out along the way in Chapter 5, were hiding Harrison Morel. So on the day of the attack on the Morel home, the Kennedale sisters were able to intercept Harrison Morel on one of his morning trade runs, which he did for his father. Harrison, again, being the eldest of the Morel children. And they intercepted him and basically saved his life. They had him holed up in their room. The Kennedale sisters are psychics, so they do their pageantry, you could say, in a room called the Tamara room, and they hid Harrison up there. And Genie is obviously very, very pleased to discover that her brother is actually alive. Being that Hansa has essentially led to Genie's rescue, Harrison, Genie, and Dominic decide to go with Hansa up north, further north, into the mountain lands where his uncle Oren is located. They're going there to escape the Keegan gang. Along the way, they get attacked themselves, as we saw in recent chapter. A man that Dominic decided not to kill, Colin McCormick, going back to Dominic's struggle, essentially, to cope with the morality of his situation here in the Murrieta territory. He decides not to kill this man, but he somewhat embarrasses him. He blows a flame over his head and knocks the man out cold while he's on guard duty, and that allows the comrades, which I call them, to escape. They travel north, and they go up into the mountain lands. They cross a rickety bridge, and Colin attacks again. So Colin, who is just desperate for revenge, who's been embarrassed, seeks Daniel Keegan's approval to go north to catch up with the comrades and attack them. And he does. He goes and attacks, and luckily they get out alive. Colin goes with two other men. The two other men aren't so lucky. They get attacked by Hansa's Grizzlies. But after a fight with Dominic, Colin manages to escape, battered badly. And Dominic's horse Nala along that way perishes as well. thanks to Colin McCormick. But eventually they are able to escape up into the mountains, the comrades, where it doesn't get any easier. Over the last 2 chapters, I believe, we've gotten to see now both a wolf attack. So after days and days of travel, the comrades get attacked by a group of wolves. Dominic attempts with a smoke bomb to get the comrades hidden from these wolves and try to divert them and get their shots off before the wolves can attack. But unfortunately, Jeannie's gun goes off due to her fear. She kind of flinches in the moment and shoots too soon. So Hansa gets attacked. Hansa, in the madness, by the time the smoke bomb finally gets to go up, it's a little too late. The wolves can still see the target that they're chasing after, and one of them grabs a hold of Hansa. Jeannie feels responsible for this as Hansa eventually loses consciousness, but she is able to kill the final wolf. And that brings us to Chapter 9. In Chapter 9, we're able to see Jeannie cope with that not decision. She didn't make a decision, but she faltered, and we're able to see her cope with that here in this chapter. She feels really bad, obviously. She feels like Hansa's situation is her fault, as she wasn't able to follow Dominic's orders. Harrison kind of talks her through it a little bit. He convinces her in some form or fashion that she actually was the one who saved Hansa. And we see kind of a little touching moment when Hansa comes to, where he acknowledges it as well, that Jeannie, if it wasn't for Jeannie, the wolf that was ripping his arm to shreds would have never been killed, and he might not have been saved at all if Jeannie hadn't left the smoke and helped him in that situation from that final wolf. So that kind of brings us to through like part 1 or 2 of Chapter 9, and then into the final part for the comrades before Chapter 10. We see a giant avalanche come and sweep them away. There's a particularly very stormy night. Some lightning creates a plume in a mountain range, and snow comes down, drags them away. Hansa actually gets separated from the rest of his friends, and where we leave off, he's kind of just in a dim haze when by the time the storm slows down a little bit. So where the comrades will end in Chapter 10, you ask? You'll just have to find out next week. But there's much more going on here. So on the other side, journeying in the other direction to the south, still is Laterra. So Laterra has gone through a whole lot. As mentioned, she was just a scared little girl in the beginning. Well, not little, she's older than Hansa, but 20 years old, in fact. But she was kind of timid. She was not out in the world, and now she's with her people in the Vahani of the Riverlands, being led by the new chieftain, Parish, who was one of her father Arkuta's councilmen. He leads the Vahani of the Riverlands following Elon south. Pretty early on, we can see that Clovis, after regrouping with William, strikes back. He strikes back at the group and is able, in a chaotic attack, to rescue Walter. Now, this happens all at the same time as the Vahani north. So we have the Vahani of the Mountainlands, and we have the Vahani of the Great Fortress, which is north of the Mountainlands, where the Grand Chieftain Varric is located. And him and the Vahani of the Great Fortress and Mountainlands send a storm of crows who send messages of disdain for the councilman. And just as Laterra hears these messages, just before she hears these messages, she also receives word from Hansa that he's alive. Hansa was too nervous to send word north when surely the councilmen were also sending contradictory messages that him and Arkuta had died. He was wondering if anyone would believe him. He wasn't sure. He felt more secure in proving his survival to his uncle and his leaders in person. But he is able to send word to Laterra, who is obviously furious when she finds out. This is a betrayal that's beyond her wildest imagination until she hears this from Hansa. But just as she does hear it from Hansa, and like I said, a storm of crows come in and black out essentially the whole scene, flying overhead and sending these messages. So again, the Vahani can control grizzlies, the Tokali can control the hogs, but we also can see that both the Vahani and Tokali can speak messages through the birds. They can use the birds for reconnaissance. They can control and speak through the birds. What's going to become key in this series is two concepts. We have the concept of control and we have the concept of command. So through the birds, through any beast that can be controlled in the mother's domain, there are these two practices that each of the clans use in order to communicate. So the concept of control is going straight into the creature's mind. So with the birds, that means like for reconnaissance, they can see what the bird sees, they can fly overhead. They essentially are out of their own mind and into the bird's mind. They can't function themselves while they're doing this. So it's full control. And then there's also the concept of command, which is more with the birds communicating the messages that they send. And then also with, like, for the grizzlies, for example, they could either control them and actually utilize the grizzlies to attack, or they can just give commands. Now, one of the reasons why they might use control versus command is that for the Vahani in the north, there aren't quite as many grizzlies. So there isn't the quantity of grizzlies that might be beneficial in a larger scale battle. So one of the reasons for control would be because their strategy tends to incorporate more of a combination of grizzlies and men, they don't want a lack of being able to monitor the grizzlies' actions. Obviously, the grizzlies in a state of combat would be full of rage. They don't want any collateral damage. It would just be unsafe and unwise. So they tend to use control more with the grizzlies in battle versus command, which they could just tell something what to do. If there's obviously not as many people, not as many of their own in a certain environment, they might just give a command to the grizzly to attack, and then the grizzly would attack, but they would be out of range enough to not startle the grizzly further into further action. Anyway, we will see more of that as the series goes on, but that's kind of the general explanation of control. So we get these commands messages through the crows as they fly overhead, and they voice their disdain for the councilmen, not because they know that of the betrayal yet, but they hear of the councilman's decision, which was to go south rather than to go north first and consult with the rest of the leadership of the Vahani. That was ultimately the choice that Arkuda wanted to make in the beginning, but the councilmen were not quite happy with that patient path, so they went south. They get attacked again by the Keegan gang during this flyover, essentially. The birds come down for defense in a way. They descend upon the camp in a mass to help out the Vahani and fight off the Keegans. However, the Keegans are able to capture Walter, and they're also able to burn down some of the huts where a lot of the supplies and rations are located. They're able to cripple the Vahani quite a bit on their journey south, and that journey only gets more and more difficult. So along the way, Laterra, at the beginning, was starting to form a bit of a bond with Elon. From the time she treated him for his wounds in chapter 1 or 2, I don't remember. One of those two chapter 1, sorry. From the time she was treating him for his wounds in chapter 1, he was this interesting foreigner, kind of. So to a girl who's been closed off to the world, it's he kind of opens up an exciting new set of possibilities for her, like a place that was previously closed off to, and along the way they kind of bond on that note, and Elon is helping her keep the people satiated, and he's encouraging them, and he's telling them where they need to go, and their friendship grows because of this. However, once they get attacked and Walter gets taken, the darkness of that scene, which is one where he actually saves Laterra, shakes him in a way that he kind of didn't see coming. So when he saves Laterra, he says anyone would have done it instead of kind of being more gallant, and Laterra is really confused by this, as again, he prevented her from being trampled, essentially. And in future chapters, after, I think that was 4, but in future chapters, we start to see him turn. And he's just like, I thought this journey would be easier. I didn't realize what was going to be included on it. And he starts to see as they start to get closer to the hold, that maybe he's not cut out for it, that maybe their friendship is not one that would be well received by the Tokali, that their people are just very different, and that he's just honestly scared. And he doesn't want to let her down. He feels that's the only thing that could possibly happen, as the clans have never got along historically. And even though that is the goal here, he's just maybe not the man he thinks he is yet. And due to their customs, he just doesn't want the shame to get in the way. And especially since we can see the interaction with his friends and his father, we can see kind of some context of the difference between the clans, and there are differences between them. So I get, like, it's a combination of embarrassment at the possibility of this friendship / possibly something more that Laterra was seeking, but he kind of lets her down in that way. And so do the councilmen, obviously, since they betrayed her and her father. And Laterra's just, it's almost as if as soon as she opens up to this new, wider world, it's all not kind of what she hoped it would be. It's a lot darker and bleaker than she hoped it would be. And she has to become something bigger, because for her people are the ones that matter. They're the ones that stand by her. They're the ones that encourage her to keep going. And it just seems to her like no one is looking out for them, which is just her purpose. I mean, it was her father's purpose. It's just her family's purpose. This is her family, especially with Elon gone, or with Hansa gone. It's just, she realizes that she's the only one that will look out for them, because the councilmen clearly aren't. They're betrayers, and they have done what they've done. So she decides to wait. She decides that the time is not now for vengeance upon the councilmen, or justice, whatever the ultimate goal would be. Because in order for her people to make it, especially with the attack by the Keegan gang, especially with that attack, in order for her to make it, they need to be confident. They need to believe in themselves, and they need to not deal with the struggles that the councilmen bring at that time, at least. So they keep going. Somewhere along the way, Laterra finds that strength. She climbs this cliff, which, as we talked about in previous weeks, was inspired by my own hills here in Austin, Texas. She gets to the top. She sees the path behind her, and she realizes who she needs to be, who she needs to become. And so she presses on. And along the way, more darkness comes, when by the time Elon is finally ready to confide in her, to confess to her what he really feels, they walk off and they find Castor. who is one of the councilmen, and he's just broken at this point. He is just filled with shame, and he just is he's just a shell of the man he once was. And he puts a gun to his head. He begs forgiveness, but he won't do anything to help, so he hasn't earned it. He hasn't earned her forgiveness, and she knows that. So Laterra lets it happen. Elon is obviously freaked out. He doesn't have anything more to say after that. Laterra summons vultures to come down and pick apart Castor, who is just not worthy of burial to her. He's not worthy. He's nothing. To her, he might as well feed the parasites. He might as well feed the vultures, so that he's just there's no more trace of him and his traitorous ways here. And again, this is what sometimes the opening to a wider world leads to. It can lead to a kind of darkness, but the path isn't over for her, and she continues on. And in that moment, in the moment of seeing the weakness of all these leaders around her and of Elon, her apparent ally around her, she just finds the strength to really give a very rousing speech to her people, one that was on one of my Instagram posts recently. It was very fun to record for this podcast, and she rouses them up, and she encourages them to keep going south, which ultimately leads us to chapter 9, where along the way they get attacked again, on the way towards a camp which had been abandoned by the Tokali, and food had been left behind. That camp was rigged to explode. It does explode, and just in a monstrous explosion blows some of their people off their horse. At first they think Elon might have had something to do with it, but then they see a Keegan member running off, and this is just a psychopath, this Keegan member. It's just a crazy person. He starts to talk about how he sees the Murrieta as the gods walk amongst men here in the Murrieta. He's obviously very brainwashed, this man, and Laterra realizes it. So when the councilmen seem to not be willing to pull the trigger immediately, she silences him and pushes them on south. And so here we are, right? And everything seems to be going well for the Keegan gang. There is definitely a long arc towards growth and strength for Laterra throughout this book. We'll talk more about what each character's arc ultimately is once we finish chapter 10. But we're nearing a very, very big conclusion for the whole world to see. As the chapter is entitled, well, it's called For the World to See, chapter 10. So we'll get into that next week. As I mentioned at the beginning, there's not a whole lot I could really go into for chapter 9, because it is a very actiony chapter. It isn't there isn't a whole lot of like Easter egg depth, I guess I could say. There isn't like a strong message other than it's the final push. I mean, this is really the final push towards where will we end up, right? For every character. And even for William Keegan, who is now kind of realizing that things have gone well for him, the Keegan gang is in a very good position, unlike everyone else so far. And yeah, so we're going to finish off chapter 10 next week, and it's going to be big. It's going to be big. I might do some more songs for that. I've been continuing a lot of the same loop tracks. I've been doing them, as you maybe can tell, based on characters. So for each character, they kind of have their own distinct song and loop track. Whether it's Laterra's, which is very distinct, Jeannie's, which is based on the song she sings in chapter 3, and which is our intro song for this podcast. And yeah, so we'll see how chapter 10 goes. It's going to be a very, very large scale chapter, and then we'll move on to book 2 following that a couple weeks after. So with another 20 minutes or so to talk, I want to go into the fact that it's my birthday week. So thank you already ahead of time for the well wishes to anyone who sends them. I don't really use my personal Facebook anymore at all because Facebook is a demon. And so if you send me a birthday wish on there, thank you. I appreciate it. But what I want to talk about now at this birthday in particular is the fact that I think for the first time, this is the first birthday where I reached where I really can honestly say that I feel like a man. And I want to talk about what it means to be a man and how you know that you've gotten to that point. And it's really, in particular, this is a perfect time, I think, because with book 1, as we talked about with Latera, and with each character, really, I will go into it in a lot more detail next week, that character arcs are kind of what define this series. So with each book, each point of view character goes through a very distinct arc from beginning to end, right? So Latera, for example, is the sheltered girl who doesn't really know much of the world, and this book is her introduction to it, right? And that introduction, so far, I mean, is a very dark one, right? It's also a hopeful one, as you can see when she climbs the mountain. There's moments where she could slip into nihilism. There's moments where she becomes a very strong leader and the only leader and essentially a mother, because it's a very matronly characteristic to want to protect the ones that you love and to be that source of care and love for the people who aren't receiving any, which is her own. They're not receiving real leadership. Excuse me. They're not receiving real leadership from their people, from their councilmen who betrayed their own chieftain unbeknownst to them. So she needs to be there for them, and she knows that. And so from beginning to end, we could see a very distinct arc for Latera. And like I said, I'll talk more about the rest of the characters next week. But for me, I feel like over the course of this series, it's been very similar. And in the same way that so this series is going to be 5 books, right? And in each book, each character has a very point A to point B arc that I lay out. Like sometimes they divert, they get there not on a straight line. They get there on like jagged lines, right? They go up and down. But they get there in one way or the other. And for me, it was kind of similar with each book. I will say that with book 1, like along the lines of how Latera deals with Elon, and that's one of the biggest ones for book 1, is how you deal with betrayal. With both Elon and the councilman. And that's one of the biggest things, again, that I took out. I mean, that's one of the experiences that I had at the time that I wanted to explore the most, and how you respond to those kinds of betrayals, and not just of other people to me, but of me to other people at times also. And sometimes it's not easy to see in the moment what you've done. And that's kind of Elon's position, right? So through Latera, I kind of explored the times of being betrayed, and through Elon, I explored times of being the betrayer, right? And so for Elon, like there's something he wants to be, right? He wants to be a hero. Latera knows he wants to be a hero. He wants to fulfill the mission of his people to bring together the 2 clans. And by the time he realizes it's much more complicated, it's much more dangerous, it's much more, it's not going to be the way, it might not be the way he envisioned, right? I mean, there's just no way. He kind of goes through it, and he can't see it. He can't see how, even by the time they do come together, he can't see how him and Laterra would work. It just wouldn't work. He knows that. He doesn't know why. He doesn't understand the reasons. But deep down, again, he does know why. But he just doesn't want to admit it to himself, because he doesn't want to admit to himself that he's embarrassed, that he knows that his friends would like rag on him, or his parents wouldn't accept the relationship and they wouldn't take kindly to her. He knows how his mother Adila would be. He knows how things would go. And he knows that there's honest reasons that make sense too, that they wouldn't work out together. But it's just impossible for him to explain. He doesn't know. He doesn't have the experience yet of being a man. And that's what being a man is. Being a man is being honest enough with yourself and with the people around you that it's not an issue to tell the truth. And that's what Elon goes through. He can't be honest. He can't. Because if he is, he'd be admitting flaws both of himself and of his people and of everything that makes him who he is. And so he suppresses it. And instead of being straight up with Laterra and saying, look, we're too different. I don't think it's going to work, and here's why. He hides, and he'll pull her to safety, but then in the next breath say, well, anyone would have done it, and just deflect and be nervous, and like he doesn't know how to handle it. But he doesn't want to abandon her straight up, because he still does have some kind of feelings, but he just doesn't know exactly what to say. Even though what to say is blatantly obvious. And what to say is the truth. Just all the time. And that's kind of one of the lessons that I think with this birthday I've finally learned and also adopted, is that it starts very small. Very small. And it grows to the point where you are the betrayer, where you have allowed yourself to lie and hurt people. And that kind of, if you've ever seen the quote that I put on Instagram, of understanding the villains as much as the heroes. And I'll read it right now. Let me open it up real quick, because it's a good one. And it's honestly one of my favorite, I guess, poems kind of thing that I've written, because I like writing short stuff real quick. But so I wrote of heroes kind and brave, with a clear intent and stroke. I built a world theirs to conquer, and it was from my heart they spoke. I broke their world all around them about as soon as it did rise. I wrote of villains with greed and hunger. What if I saw too from their eyes? And that's essentially what it boils down to, is that you have to be able to see both. You can't design villains that are just one-dimensional, that you can't understand the reason for their decisions. Like the councilmen are the villains in this case, and you can understand, like, in some way, what they're doing, what they think is best for their people. As we see in the beginning, Arcuda mentions Parrish's father was killed by the Easterners. So in Parrish's mind, the ultimate enemy is the Easterners. We have to do whatever we can to save ourselves from the Easterners. And even if that, for him, he lies to himself. He tells himself, that's it. That's the only way. And he's not straight up. He doesn't tell this with enough compassion. He doesn't find a solution with Arcuda. So he justifies murdering him. It's obviously a very extreme example. But for his case, that's what a villain is comprised of, is decisions that are made for reasons that they can't come to terms with, to the point where they act in a, at times, frankly, evil way. And I know that in my past, like, there's things that I wouldn't have wanted to do that I've done. And I don't know if I would say it's evil, but it was definitely, sometimes you do things that are immoral. And you have to be able to accept the things that you've done that are immoral and move on and not do them again. And that's what it comes down to in terms of being a man. When you become a man is when you live without lies, when you live without doing things that you know is wrong, when you live according to a moral code and you accept that that moral code is not really black and white. It's clear. It's very, very clear. You don't lie. You don't do things that you know are wrong. You don't do things that you know will bring you down a path of addiction, of being unable to defend the ones you love. And that's the point where I finally feel like I've reached, which is amazing. I mean, it's amazing. But without book one, again, that's kind of, through the context of book one, that's where I feel like that's the kind of conflict that I really wanted to study. And that's where I feel like I've advanced the most, thanks to, at this point. There's a lot of other... I think at the end of each book, I'm going to kind of do a talk like this, like what it means to not just be a man, I guess. I say be a man because I am one, right? There's some very strong female characters in here. As I mentioned, with Laterra, it's not as much of defense. It's not as much of I mean, it is protection. It is, but it's caring. It's becoming a defender of her people and a motherly figure to her people, which they don't have. They don't have that protector anymore. So, I'm trying to think if I want to go into much more detail about that, or if I want to wait more till book two. And I think I can. So again, with my birthday having passed, or my birthday coming up this week, it's really dawned on me, especially now with book 4 getting wrapped up. And I think I've mentioned this before, but with book 4 getting wrapped up, one of the things I was really thinking about at the end of the process in the last couple months, excuse me, was, have I earned the path to book 5? Have I earned the right to conclude these characters' trajectories, to get them to a place where they can reach a finality? And I think that the best way to describe reaching that finality for me is being a man, and for the female characters, becoming a woman. And there is no real finality in life, right? For the finality is death. I mean, that's really it. And even after that, who knows? But the finality of life is only death. There's no more. There's always growth. There's always change, and you will continue on through all of that, and you need to keep growing. But for this series, I think more than anything, it's coming of age, and I see it now more than I did before. I always just kind of thought of it as an epic fantasy. I always kind of thought of it as an exploration of morality, which coming of age is exploring morality. But that's kind of the way that more of how I thought about it before. But now I definitely, as I finish it, as I get to a point where the character arcs are over the course of 5 books now, rather than just each one. So you go from A to B in 1, you go from B to C in 2, but from A to D, from A to D, from A to E, we can see that it's all part of a much bigger journey, which is of finding meaning in life and acting on that meaning in life and that moral code that you develop over time. And there's a very definitive code. It's not up in the air. It's very, very definitive. The right and wrong is definitive. You don't seek vengeance. You don't try to be God. You take what you're given and you act according to the code set forth before you. And for this book, some people do that and some people don't. And for this series, some people do that and some people don't. But coming to discover that is kind of the arc that we're on, and it's the arc that at the birthday that I'm at my 26th year, which is ironic because it coincides with me finally having to pay health insurance. Maybe that's why they did it. Maybe you have to pay health insurance at 26 for a reason. Who knows? But anyway, at my 26th year, I think I can finally finish this series because I understand what it means to be a man for the first time in my life. I understand my moral code for the first time in my life. I understand how I should behave, how I should treat other people, that I'm responsible for myself and for those that I love and that I care for, and that I need to be stronger for them than I thought I could at any time for myself. And that's hard. That's really hard at times. It's hard to lead, especially when you haven't reached a point of growth yourself. But when you have reached it, when you do become a man and you know it, you better fucking lead. You better do what you know is right. Because if you don't, then how can you call yourself good? You can't. And for a while, I wasn't. We all aren't at some point. But once we do those things, once we realize what's wrong, it's time to start doing what's right. It's time to start living right. And at 26, I think I'm finally doing that. And it feels really good. And I'm not going to stop. And I'm not going to stop writing. I can't wait to, oh my God, share book 4 with the world. Wrapping up here, I just want to say that it is so epic, and I feel so good about it, that it just pains me that it's been so delayed. I really wish there was more I could do. As I've mentioned before, my editor got pregnant at the time of editing. My cover guy has now gotten a broken wrist at the time of making the cover. So I think we're almost ready. The interiors are done. The interior for the paperback and ebooks are done. I think we're very close to being able to finish up the cover. He's been healing for a couple weeks now, so fingers crossed. But we'll see. And once they are ready, I have the other 30 books. Yeah. I have the other 30 books ready for the giveaway. I'm going to be giving away books 1 through 4 once 4 is finished and delivered to me to 10 different people. It's going to be an Instagram giveaway, so you'll just have to comment the same way you do for a lot of businesses. You simply just have to tag a friend who likes to read, or more friends. You'll get more votes if you tag more friends. And I'm just going to randomly kind of select 10 people who'll get to read the whole series. And I've refurbished the whole series. It's in peak physical condition. And book 4 is going to blow your fucking mind. Let me tell you. It's as good as anything I could ever create or have created to this point in my life. It's everything that I've been working for the first 4 books. And it's going to lead to a pretty epic book 5. It's going to be pretty epic. Because as I've said I feel like I can finally write it with a clear mind, and a mind where I know that it will be what it deserves to be. Unlike another series we know that recently ended in shambles. Because the guys who just want to go direct Star Wars decided to ruin it. I'm not going to get there. I'm not going to go there. Thanks for listening in. This has been Nicholas Austin. This has been Tuesday Night Fiction. If you really like the podcast, please support by going and buying the books. You could buy the ebook or the paperback. You don't even have to read them. You could just listen to the podcast since it is an audiobook podcast. But if you buy the books, it's just a very helpful thing. They're very pretty. If you want to just buy them and put them on your shelf to just stare at all day long, they're very nice to look at. And you'd be supporting me, and I'd really appreciate it. It keeps the podcast going. All the support to date has been hugely appreciated. Also, if you have read the books, if you could go to Amazon and leave a 5-star review, that would be fantastic. If you enjoyed them at a 5-star and had a 5-star experience with them, which I'm sure you will, especially book 4. It's like 17 stars, if I'm being honest. So start the series now. Leave some feedback. If you enjoy the podcast, comment on Instagram or send something to my contact form. If you have any feedback, you want me to do something, give you a shout out, anything, I'll do whatever you say. Well, no, I won't, because I'm a man and I don't do whatever anyone says. Anyway, again, thanks for listening in. We'll talk to you again next week with Chapter 10, What Was Once Whole. And it's going to blow your mind. It's going to be biblical. But, till then, again, Nicholas Austin, Tuesday Night Fiction. Have a good night. Talk to you next week.